The coffee hit his sleeve before I even understood what my own hand had done. I felt the cup tip, felt the heat jump off the china, and then I was watching dark liquid bloom across pale gray like it had always meant to land there. 12 floors above the city, in a private dining room, where deals worth more than my entire life got signed over appetizers nobody finished. I had just ruined a stranger's jacket in front of everyone who mattered to my paycheck. I'm Maravos. Before that moment, I was good at being forgettable. I'd worked the rooftop at Le Meridian for 3 years, and I built every shift around the same rule. Quiet steps, quick refills, hair combed forward on the left side to cover the thin scar along my jaw. Nobody remembers the waitress who never spills anything, never says the wrong thing, never gives you a reason to look twice. That was the plan. That had always been the plan. Every dollar I made after rent went into one envelope, hidden inside a shoebox on my closet shelf, meant for one thing: buying back my father's diner. He built that place with his own hands, booth by booth, and when a kitchen fire took half of it the year I was 10. This scar is what's left of that night. He spent years fighting the insurance company just to keep the doors open. He held on right up until his heart gave out 2 years ago. After that, the diner disappeared into a stack of legal paperwork I still didn't fully understand, folded into some company that existed only on letterhead. I've been saving quietly for over a year, one shift at a time, to get it back. Which is why, when I was told with no warning to cover the private room upstairs, my hands were already unsteady before I ever touched the coffee pot. The men in that room didn't talk like people who worried about money. They talked like people who decided things, low voices and long pauses, the kind of quiet that costs more than shouting. And the man at the head of the table, dark suit, no tie, a stillness to him that made the whole room settle just because he'd sat down, wore a gold cufflink stamped with a ship's will wrapped in rope. I'd seen that exact symbol before, stamped at the bottom of every foreclosure letter I'd spent a year fighting in a drawer at home. My hand shook. The coffee went everywhere. My manager appeared out of nowhere, already apologizing before he reached the table, already gripping my elbow. "This account is worth more than you are," he said, not quietly enough for me to pretend I hadn't heard it. "You're done. Get your things." Picture walking across a full dining room with every eye following you, knowing you're not coming back tomorrow, knowing rent is due in 11 days and the shoebox in your closet is still $4,000 short of the number that matters. That was me, walking toward the elevator, staring straight ahead so nobody would see my face come apart. I almost made it. "Wait," he said. Not loud. He didn't need to be loud. Everyone stopped. My manager stopped. I stopped because something underneath his voice made it impossible not to. He was looking at the small brass tag pinned above my apron pocket, the one with my name on it. "Voss," he said, like he was finally saying a word he'd been carrying around for years. I had never told anyone at that restaurant my last name. It wasn't on any schedule they could see. It wasn't something I offered to strangers. He knew it anyway. If you've ever had a moment where the ground just quietly stopped being solid under your feet, you already know exactly how that felt. Stay with me for this one, because what he said next didn't just save my job. It cracked open a door I'd spent 2 years trying to keep shut. So go ahead and hit subscribe now, because you're not going to want to miss where this goes. He stood, which apparently men like him didn't do for waitresses, judging by the way my manager's face drained of color. "She keeps her job," he said, "and you're going to apologize to her, not the other way around." My manager stammered something about the account, about how sorry he was, already reversing course so fast it would have been funny if I'd had any energy left to laugh. I got my job back in under a minute, standing there in a stained apron, humiliated in a completely different way than I'd been by the firing. Every server on that floor was watching me get rescued by a stranger who somehow already knew my name, and I understood, right then, exactly how that would look to them by tomorrow morning. I didn't say thank you. I want to be honest about that, because I think it says something about who I was back then. I said, "How do you know my name?" He didn't answer, not really. He said something about needing to speak with me after my shift, then sat back down like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just rearranged the entire room with 2 sentences and a look. I finished the shift on autopilot. Every table I served, I found myself glancing back at his, watching how carefully his associates chose their words around him, how the air itself seemed to change when he leaned forward. Whoever he wasn't just wealthy. Wealthy men don't make grown men in expensive suits go pale with one sentence. This was something else, and I didn't yet have a word for it. A coworker named Priya caught me refilling water glasses with my hand still shaking and pulled me aside near the service station. "You okay?" she asked, glancing toward his table like it might bite. I told her I was fine, which wasn't true, and she didn't push, just handed me a clean rag and told me to fix my apron before anyone noticed the coffee stains still soaked into the fabric. It was a small kindness, the kind I usually didn't let myself notice, but that night it stuck with me longer than it should have. Proof that not everyone in that room wanted something from me. By the time the closed-door meeting broke up, most of his associates filed out without a glance in my direction, the way important men do when a room stops mattering to them. He was the last one still seated, turning a coffee spoon over in his fingers like he was deciding something that had nothing to do with the drink in front of him. He caught me by the service elevator afterward. Up close, he didn't look like what I expected. No cold stare, no performance of menace. Just a tired kind of focus, like a man who'd been carrying something heavy for so long it had become part of how he stood. I asked him again, "How do you know my name?" He said his own instead. Dante Cassano. I'd heard it before, the way you hear a name on the news and file it away without really absorbing it. Shipping. Import contracts. A name that showed up in business articles next to words like holdings and acquisitions, never next to anything you could actually pin down. I told him I didn't want his help, that I didn't know him, that powerful men who suddenly knew things about me had never once meant anything good in my life. I meant my father's old business contacts, the ones who circled him while he was sick and vanished the moment he stopped being useful. I meant every version of that pattern I'd already learned to expect. He didn't argue with me. He just said one thing before he walked away. "Ask your father's old business partner why I know your name. There's only one person that could be." Nolan Reyes had been my father's partner for almost a decade, and for the past year, he'd been the one person quietly helping me fight the foreclosure, the one adult in my life I still trusted without a second thought. I stood in that stairwell a long time after Dante left, turning the sentence over and over. Because whatever the answer was, it meant two men I'd never connected before tonight had apparently been connected the whole time, and I had absolutely no idea for how long. I called Nolan before I'd even reached the parking garage. He picked up on the second ring, the way he always did, like he'd been waiting. "I need to ask you something," I said. "Do you know a man named Dante Cassano?" There was a pause, just half a second, but I caught it, the kind of pause where someone is deciding which version of the truth to hand you. "Where did you hear that name?" he said, instead of answering. I told him everything. The coffee, the firing, the reinstatement, my last name, spoken like a password I hadn't given anyone. Nolan went quiet again, and when he finally spoke, his voice had changed, careful in a way I wasn't used to from him. "Stay away from him, Mara," he said. "Whatever he's offering, it's not free. Men like that don't do anything without expecting something back." I asked what he meant by men like that. He wouldn't say more over the phone. He told me to come by his office in the morning, that we needed to talk about the diner anyway, that there'd been some movement on the paperwork. I hung up feeling worse than I had all night. Not because of Dante, because of the way Nolan had answered a simple question with an instruction instead of an answer. In 3 years of him managing my father's estate, of him fighting for that buyback alongside me, he had never once told me to stay away from anyone. I went home to an apartment that still smelled faintly, impossibly like the diner did before the fire. Some trick of memory I couldn't explain, and I sat on the edge of my bed holding the shoebox in my lap. For $1,000 short. 11 days until rent. And now a stranger who somehow knew exactly who I was, and the one person I trusted most, suddenly sounding like he was hiding something behind every careful word. I told myself I'd get answers in the morning. I told myself Nolan would explain everything, that it would all make sense, that the tightness in my chest would loosen once he did. I didn't know yet that the name Reyes was about to mean something very different to me than it had that night, or that the person I trusted most was already sitting on a secret that would end up costing me everything. I barely slept. Around 4 in the morning, I gave up trying and sat at my kitchen table with the shoebox open in front of me, counting bills I'd already counted a dozen times that week, as if the number might change if I looked at it hard enough. It didn't. 4,000 short was still 4,000 short, and now it came with a stranger's face attached to it, a stranger who apparently knew things about my life that I'd never said out loud in that restaurant. I thought about my father a lot that night, more than I usually let myself. He used to say the diner wasn't the building. It was the people who kept coming back to it. I used to think that was just something he said to make the insurance fight easier to swallow. Sitting there with the shoebox in my lap, I understood it differently. He'd meant it as a promise to himself, one he never got to finish keeping. I fell asleep on the table around 5 and woke up an hour later with a headache and a name pounding through it like a second heartbeat. Cassano. Nolan's office looked the way it always did. Property files stacked in leaning towers, a framed photo of him and my father standing outside the diner the week it opened, coffee going cold on the corner of his desk. He looked tired that morning, more tired than usual, and he didn't waste time on small talk. The buyback window just got cut, he said. You had 6 months left. Now you have 30 days. I felt my stomach drop straight through the floor. 30 days. I didn't have $4,000 in 30 days, let alone the full balance. I asked him how that was even possible, whether it was legal, whether someone had made a mistake. He said the mortgage holder had the right to adjust terms under a clause buried in the original paperwork, one my father had signed years before either of us fully understood what we were dealing with. Then he told me the name of the company holding that mortgage. Cassano Maritime Holdings. I sat there staring at him while the pieces clicked into place slower than they should have. Dante Cassano. The man who'd known my name before I'd ever said it. The man now apparently squeezing the timeline on the one thing I had left of my father. I confronted him that afternoon. I found the address of his shipping office downtown, walked in past a receptionist who clearly wasn't used to people arriving uninvited, and told him exactly what I thought of him cutting my window down to 30 days like it meant nothing. He looked genuinely confused, not performing it. Actually confused, the kind of reaction that's hard to fake on the spot. He said he hadn't touched that account, that he'd look into who authorized the change, and something in the way he said it made me believe him even though I didn't want to. If it wasn't him, I asked, then who? He didn't have an answer yet. Neither did I. That diner isn't just a building to me, and I think that's worth saying plainly. My father built it out of nothing, nearly lost everything trying to keep it after the fire, and held on until the day he died believing I'd finish what he started. Getting it back was never about the money. It was about proving his last 2 years of struggling for it meant something. So when I say the 30-day window felt like the floor giving out under me, I mean it took the one thing I had left and put a countdown on it. I went home that night still shaken, and when I logged into my savings account to calculate exactly how impossible 30 days actually was, I found it frozen. A red banner across the top of the screen. Account under review, pending fraud audit. Someone had reported me. I sat there staring at that message for a long time, because a frozen account doesn't happen by accident, and a fraud audit doesn't start itself. Somebody had picked up a phone and made a call. Somebody who knew enough about that account to make the report sound credible. I thought about calling my father's old accountant, a woman named Ruth, who'd helped him file taxes for 15 years before he died, just to ask if a review like this could really happen this fast, this cleanly, without any warning. She confirmed what I already suspected. Fraud audits don't move at this speed unless someone with real influence pushes them through. That detail sat in my stomach like a stone for the rest of the night. Someone hadn't just reported me. Someone had made sure it stuck. If it wasn't Dante freezing me out, then someone far closer already had. And if you've ever felt the ground shift under you twice in 1 week, tell me in the comments, because I promise you, this was only the beginning. I called the bank first thing the next morning, standing in my kitchen in yesterday's clothes, and got exactly what you'd expect from an automated system built to protect itself instead of the person on the other end of the line. Your account has been flagged for review. A specialist will contact you within 5 to 7 business days. I asked what specialist, what review, who filed it, and got the same 3 sentences read back to me in a different order, like the woman on the other end had a card in front of her with nothing else printed on it. I went to work anyway because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. Waiting tables that day felt like moving through water. Every plate heavier than it should have been, every customer's voice arriving half a second late, like my brain was still back in that stairwell, trying to make sense of a name I hadn't said out loud in years. Priya asked twice if I was all right. Twice I told her I was fine. By the end of the shift, I wasn't sure either of us believed it anymore. That night, I went back through every piece of paperwork Nolan had ever sent me, looking for something, anything, that might explain how someone could have known enough about that account to make a fraud report sound credible. I didn't find an answer. I found something worse, a gap. A wire transfer from 3 months earlier, small, unexplained, routed through an account I didn't recognize, sitting quietly in the middle of a spreadsheet I'd trusted completely because Nolan had built it. I stared at it for a long time before deciding it had to be a clerical error. I wanted it to be a clerical error badly enough that I believed myself. The fraud investigator's office smelled like burnt coffee and warm printer toner, and the woman across the desk had a folder with my name on it thick enough to make my chest go tight just looking at it. Someone had filed a formal complaint. Skimming tips, falsifying hours, funneling the difference into a personal account over the course of a year, which, in the twisted logic of the accusation, was exactly what my careful saving looked like from the outside. I sat there answering questions I barely understood, watching my whole career balance on whether this woman believed me, when the door opened and a lawyer walked in. Sharp suit, calm voice, a business card that said he represented me before I'd ever agreed to be represented. He'd been sent. I didn't have to ask by who. I felt two things at once, and I think it matters that I'm honest about both. Relief, because that lawyer picked the complaint apart within 20 minutes, exposing gaps that made it obvious someone had fabricated most of it. And anger, because I hadn't asked for this. Dante had reached into my life without permission, again, and I was starting to understand that being protected by someone can feel almost as unsettling as being unprotected. I confronted him about it that night, expecting another argument. Instead, he suggested we get something to eat, somewhere quiet, somewhere that wasn't a boardroom or an interrogation room. We ended up at a 24-hour diner 2 blocks from my apartment, cracked vinyl booths, a jukebox that hadn't worked in years, the kind of place that felt uncomfortably like walking straight back into my father's. We talked for almost 2 hours. Nothing about danger, nothing about foreclosures. The worst customers I'd ever served. The fact that he apparently couldn't cook anything beyond eggs. Small, ordinary things that had nothing to do with debts or cufflinks or frozen accounts. It was the first time since the coffee spilled across his sleeve that I saw him as a person instead of a threat. Near the end, he got quieter. He told me, without going into detail, that my father had done something for him years ago, something he'd spent a long time trying to repay. He wouldn't say what yet. He said I deserved the full story, but not until he was sure I was safe enough to hear it without it putting me in more danger than I was already in. I went home turning that over instead of the fraud complaint, which tells you something about where my head was that night. The next morning, over coffee I wrote a list. Everyone who could possibly have known enough about my savings account to file a report that's specific. It wasn't a long list. My manager, a coworker or two, and Nolan, who had full access to every financial record tied to the estate and the buyback fund, because I trusted him with all of it. I crossed his name off almost as fast as I wrote it. Not because it didn't make sense, because I didn't want it to. I'd cross every name off that list except one, and I wasn't ready to write it down yet. The messages started 3 days later. Small things at first, sent from numbers that led nowhere when I tried calling back. One noted the exact time I'd left work the night before. Another mentioned the scar along my jaw, something I kept covered on purpose, something strangers weren't supposed to notice. Someone was watching me closely enough to know details I actively hid from the world. It's a different kind of fear than a threat shouted across a room. Nobody grabbed me. Nobody followed me that I could see. It was quieter than that. And somehow worse, the slow realization that my ordinary days, the ones I thought were private, had an audience I couldn't name. I started doubting every read I had on every person around me. Coworkers who'd always been friendly suddenly felt like question marks. I caught myself wondering if Dante's world was protecting me from something, or if it had made me a target that never existed before he sat down at my table. I stopped taking the same route home from work, which felt paranoid and necessary at the same time. I started counting how many people got off at my bus stop, memorizing the regulars, flinching at anyone new. I told myself I was being careful. Some nights, I wasn't sure if I was being careful or if I just started living inside the fear instead of managing it. The two states blurring together until I couldn't remember what ordinary tiredness used to feel like. Priya noticed the change before I said anything to her. She found me sitting on an overturned crate in the alley behind the kitchen on my break, staring at my phone like it might tell me something it hadn't already told me twice. "You've been somewhere else all week," she said, not unkindly. I didn't know how to explain any of it without sounding like I'd lost my mind. So I told her half the truth, that someone had been sending strange messages, that I didn't know who, and left out the part where a man who owned half the docks downtown had somehow known my last name before I'd ever offered it. She squeezed my shoulder and told me to be careful walking home. It wasn't much. It was more than I'd let anyone give me in a long time. I went to him directly and told him I was done with half-truths. If I was in danger, I needed to know exactly why. He told me about a family called Petrakis, old rivals of his, going back decades, the kind of grudge that outlives the people who started it. And then he finally told me the rest of what he'd been holding back. 9 years ago, when he was 19, the Petrakis family tried to frame him for something he hadn't done, something that would have ended his life as he knew it before it really started. My father, of all people, had been the one witness who could clear him, and he did, publicly, at real cost to himself. That decision cracked his standing with people who mattered to his business, quietly bled into the years that followed, and never once got mentioned to me. Dante had spent a decade trying to track down the daughter of the man who saved him, meaning to repay a debt he never got the chance to settle while my father was alive. His enemies had only just made the connection between us, and that was why, out of nowhere, I'd become worth watching. Every single thing Dante had done since that spilled coffee reorganized itself in my head in that moment. He hadn't fought for my job because of some spark between us. He'd done it because he owed my father everything, and I was the only piece of that debt still standing. We were sitting close together when he told me this, closer than I'd realized, and for one long second, neither of us moved. I felt myself leaning in, felt him do the same, and then I pulled back myself before anything happened because my head was too full of everything he just told me to trust anything my body wanted in that moment. The truth just changed everything I thought I knew about him. And if you've ever had someone's whole story rearrange itself in front of you in a single conversation, subscribe right now, because what comes next is going to test everything both of us think we understand about debt and about wanting someone for reasons that have nothing to do with what you owe them. He owed my father everything. And lying awake that night, I couldn't stop wondering if that's all I would ever be to him. An unpaid debt with a face. I replayed every kindness he'd shown me since the coffee spilled, turning each one over like a coin to see what was stamped on the other side. The lawyer at the fraud interview. The diner booth conversation about nothing. The way he'd looked at me in that stairwell like I was the only fixed point in a room full of moving pieces. I wanted to believe none of it was obligation. I wasn't sure yet if wanting that badly enough could make it true, or if it just meant I was setting myself up to be disappointed by a man who'd never promised me anything beyond a debt he intended to close out. I texted him once, around midnight, and deleted it before sending. I typed it again an hour later and sent that one instead. Just one line. Is any of this actually about me? He didn't answer until morning, and when he did, it wasn't a text. He showed up at the restaurant before my shift started, stood at the host stand looking like he hadn't slept either, and said the only honest thing he could offer me right then. I don't know yet. I'm trying to find out. I didn't know what to do with an answer that honest, so I just nodded and went to clock in, carrying it with me through an entire shift like a stone in my pocket. The fraud investigation stalled out over the following week, not cleared, just stuck in a slow, bureaucratic limbo that left the threat hanging over me without resolving it. And the foreclosure clock kept ticking regardless. 20 days left, then 18, my savings account still half frozen, the math getting worse every time I looked at it. Then, out of nowhere, an offer showed up. A cash buyer well above what the property was worth, wanting to close fast, no complications, no questions asked. On paper, it looked like the answer to everything. In reality, it felt engineered, the kind of deal that shows up exactly when you're desperate enough to stop asking why. I was tempted anyway. I want to admit that honestly. Not because the money solved my problem cleanly, but because taking it meant I could walk away from all of it, from Dante, from a debt neither of us had asked for, from being someone's unfinished business. Pure pride, if I'm being fair to myself. I was exhausted from being protected by someone I didn't fully trust yet. I ran the numbers a dozen different ways on a legal pad on my kitchen table, trying to find some version of the math that let me take the offer without feeling like I was betraying my father's memory in the process. The cash would clear my rent, clear the fraud complaint's lingering shadow over my finances, put real distance between me and Cassano Maritime Holdings and everything tied to that name. It would also mean the diner became someone else's building, gutted and repurposed into whatever a shell company wanted it to be, my father's name erased from a deed that had carried it for 20 years. I sat with that legal pad until the coffee went cold, and I still didn't have a clean answer by morning. Nolan pushed hard for me to take it. He framed it as protecting me, getting me clear of Dante's world before it swallowed me whole. And at the time it read as genuine concern. He'd been a steady one through all of this. I had no reason yet to hear anything else underneath his urgency. Meanwhile, without telling me, Dante quietly outbid the offer through an anonymous proxy, protecting the property before I'd made any decision at all. I found out by accident, tracing the paperwork back further than I was supposed to, and it lit something in me. Help without asking first isn't always help. Sometimes it's just control wearing a kinder face, and I needed him to understand the difference between the two. I went to the escrow office anyway, still leaning toward signing the cash offer out of sheer stubbornness, wanting to prove I could solve this without owing anyone anything. I had the pen in my hand when my phone rang. A contact from Dante's lawyer, tracing the buyer's shell company back through 3 layers of paperwork to a name directly tied to the Petrakis family. I put the pen down. I tore the offer in half right there at the desk, in front of Nolan, who had driven me there himself. For one unguarded second, something crossed his face that wasn't relief. It was anger, real and sharp, gone almost before I registered it, replaced instantly by concern for me, by asking if I was all right. I told myself I'd imagined it. I had too much else to process that day to sit with what it might have meant. Did you catch it? Something about that reaction wasn't right, and I want you to comment below if you noticed it too, because I promise you, I should have trusted my own eyes a lot sooner than I did. I trusted Nolan with everything since my father died, every document, every piece of the fight for that diner, every late-night phone call when I didn't know who else to call. So why did tearing up that offer make him look like a man who just lost something? I didn't have an answer yet. I wasn't ready to look for one. I drove home from the escrow office in silence, replaying the look on his face over and over, trying to explain it away with every ordinary reason I could think of. Stress, money worries of his own, the general exhaustion of driving someone else's disaster around town for a year. None of the explanations fit quite right, and I hated how much space that ill-fitting feeling took up in my chest for the rest of the day. That evening, Dante called to check on the escrow situation, and I told him what happened, watching for his reaction the way I'd started watching everyone's reactions lately. He went quiet for a moment, then said something that stuck with me longer than I wanted it to. People don't get angry over money that was never theirs to lose, Mara. They get angry over money they were counting on. I asked him what that meant. He said he didn't know yet either, but that it was worth remembering. The article ran 2 days later. A gossip site that covered Cassano's business dealings for clicks, not accuracy, ran a piece linking shipping magnate Dante Cassano to a mystery waitress, complete with a photo from the diner where we'd sat that night, and details about my father's old case twisted just enough to imply I'd known Dante for years, that I was somehow complicit in whatever his world involved. It spread fast, the way ugly things always do. By the next morning, the restaurant had suspended me pending review, worried about the negative attention. I went from a woman quietly saving for her father's diner to a headline in about 18 hours, and there was nothing accurate about any of it. I confronted Dante, but not about the danger this time, about something simpler and, in a way, harder. He had let his world spill into mine without ever once asking if I wanted it there. The lawyer at the fraud interview, the proxy bid on the property, and now this, whether or not he caused it directly, it was a consequence of orbiting someone whose life came with an audience I never agreed to. I told him I needed distance. Debt or no debt, history or no history. I needed space to figure out who I was in all of this without his world making every decision around me before I even got a say. He didn't fight me on it, which somehow made it harder. His people traced the leak that same day, back through a phone record tied directly to Nolan's office. Hard evidence now, not a look across an escrow desk. But no motive yet. Nothing that explained why the one person outside of Dante who knew the most about my life would hand a tabloid the details of my worst week. I was sitting alone that night, jobless in every practical sense, my name attached to a story that wasn't true, when my phone buzzed with a message from Nolan. "We need to talk. Tonight. Please." 4 words. That's all it took to make my hands start shaking again. The same way they had the night the coffee spilled across a stranger's sleeve and my whole life started tilting sideways. I sat with that message for almost an hour before answering, cycling through every version of what he might want to tell me. An apology for the leak, maybe, though the evidence pointed his way and I hadn't confronted him with it yet. An update on the buyback timeline. Something about the escrow office, about that flash of anger I still hadn't found a place to put. Nothing I imagined came close to what was waiting for me. I almost called Dante before I left the apartment. My thumb hovered over his name in my contacts for a long moment. I told myself I didn't need him there, that this was Nolan, the man who'd sat across from me at 100 kitchen tables while we untangled my father's estate one document at a time, the man who'd never once given me a real reason to be afraid of him. I put my phone in my pocket instead and drove to the old diner alone, which I've had a lot of times since to wish I hadn't done. She lost her job, her privacy, and her name in the papers over a debt she never even asked for. If that makes you as angry as it made me, share this, because what Nolan told her that night was worse than anything the papers printed. I met him at the old diner site, the building still boarded up, still smelling faintly of smoke a decade later, no matter how many times it had been cleaned. It felt right, somehow, meeting there. Full circle, in a way I didn't want. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. He told me the truth before I even had to ask for it. And it came out of him in pieces, like he'd been carrying it too long to hold it together anymore. He owed money, a gambling debt he'd hidden from everyone, including me, going back almost 2 years. The Petrakis family found out and used it as leverage, and for over a year, he'd been feeding them information about me, my schedule, the buyback fund, everything they'd eventually need to use me against Dante. It hadn't started out of malice toward me. It started out of fear for himself, and it had gone further than he ever meant to let it go. I stood there in the ruins of my father's diner, listening to the one person I trusted most in the world admit he'd been the watcher this whole time. I didn't know if I wanted to scream or cry or just walk away and never look back. I asked him how long. He said 14 months, almost the entire time he'd been helping me fight for the buyback, which meant every late-night phone call, every document he'd walked me through, every reassurance he'd given me about the process had a second purpose running underneath it that I'd never once suspected. I asked him about the wire transfer I'd found buried in his spreadsheet, the one I'd talked myself into believing was a clerical error. He flinched like I'd hit him. That was the first payment, he said. I told myself it would be the only one. I wanted to ask him 100 more questions. Whether any of the real estate advice had been real. Whether he'd actually been negotiating on my behalf or just stalling long enough to keep feeding information to people who wanted me exposed. I didn't get the chance to ask any of them, because that's when the side door opened. He said one more thing before either of us could decide what came next. "They're done watching. They're moving tonight." 2 men stepped out from the side entrance before I could even process the warning. Everything after that happened fast. Nolan pushing me toward the back exit, telling me to run, putting himself between me and them in a way I never expected from him. Not after everything. He went down hard, hurt badly enough that I heard it more than saw it in the dark. and I ran because he told me to, because some instinct older than my anger at him took over. I made it 2 blocks before I stopped shaking enough to reach for my phone. I'd spent weeks pushing Dante away, telling him I needed distance, telling myself I could handle my own life without him. Standing in an alley with my hands too unsteady to unlock my screen, I didn't even know if I'd get the chance to call him. The danger just became real for the first time in this whole story, and I need you to subscribe right now, because you do not want to miss what happens in the next part. He answered on the first ring. I don't remember exactly what I said, only that it came out broken and half-formed, and that he was already moving before I finished the sentence. I remember headlights cutting through the dark. I remember his voice staying steady, even when mine wasn't. I remember being pulled into a car and realizing, somewhere in the middle of it, that I was safe, actually safe, for the first time since that message from Nolan had lit up my phone. The mechanics of what happened after that matter less to me now than what came next. Sitting in his kitchen at 2 in the morning, wrapped in a blanket that wasn't mine, finally still enough to talk. He told me the whole truth this time, no more half versions. The debt to my father had started everything, yes. He'd spent almost a decade quietly searching, tracing an old address that led nowhere, a name change on my mother's side that nearly buried the trail entirely, years of dead, and before someone finally connected a serving job at Le Meridien to a Voss he'd been looking for since he was 19 years old and terrified in a way he'd never let himself be terrified again. But somewhere between the coffee in the diner booth and the night he stood in a stairwell, watching me choose independence over his help, it had stopped being about repayment. He'd stayed quiet too long, he admitted, because he was afraid that saying it out loud would make anything real between us feel transactional, like I was one more account he was settling. I asked him what he'd imagined, all those years he spent looking. He said he used to picture handing someone an envelope and walking away, debt closed, obligation finished, the kind of clean transaction that let him sleep at night. He said he hadn't planned on any of what actually happened, hadn't planned on a woman who argued with him in a hallway instead of taking his money, hadn't planned on missing her the first week she asked for distance, hadn't planned on any of it turning into something he wanted to keep instead of something he wanted to finish. I told him something I hadn't said out loud to anyone, that my independence wasn't really about pride. It was fear, plain and simple. Fear of loving someone whose world could take everything the way it had taken everything from my father. Integrity had cost him his business once already. I didn't know if I could survive loving a version of that story twice. Neither of us fixed anything with that conversation. But for the first time, neither of us was keeping score either. We sat there a while longer, not saying much, just letting the quiet settle into something comfortable instead of something tense. He made eggs at 2 in the morning because it was apparently the only thing he actually knew how to cook, and they were mediocre, and I told him so. And he laughed for the first time since I'd known him, a real laugh, surprised out of him, nothing careful about it. It struck me that I'd never once heard him laugh before that night, not in every version of danger and debt we'd waded through together. It felt like a small, ordinary miracle, sitting in a kitchen at 2 in the morning eating bad eggs with a man who'd spent a decade trying to find me, laughing about something that had nothing to do with any of it. On the practical side, the attack outside the diner gave Dante's people exactly what they needed. Hard evidence, an identifiable attack on a private citizen, enough to move against the Petrakis family through legal and public channels instead of anything uglier. It wasn't clean, and it wasn't instant, but it was real, built on exposure and pressure rather than another act of violence answering the last one. Nolan survived. He gave a full statement once he was well enough, naming everyone involved in exchange for protection, and it cost him everything he'd built, his license, his reputation, the version of himself he'd spent years constructing. I won't pretend that was easy to watch, even after what he'd done. He'd also stepped between me and 2 armed men without hesitation, and both things were true about him at once. I've had to learn to hold both without needing one to cancel out the other. Was Nolan's betrayal forgivable, or did he cross a line he can't come back from? I still don't fully know the answer, and I'd love to hear what you think in the comments, because I'm not sure this one has a clean side to land on. For the first time in this entire story, neither of us was keeping score of what we owed each other. That's the part one keep coming back to. more than the danger, more than the reveal. It's a strange kind of relief, realizing you can want someone without a ledger attached to it. The legal case moved slower than either of us wanted, but it moved. With Nolan's statement and Dante's countermove, the shell company holding my father's diner had its claim invalidated through an actual fraud finding, the kind that holds up because it's true, not because someone wrote a check to make a problem disappear. I got the deed back through the process the story had been building toward the whole time, not through a rescue, not through a gift, through work and time, and the truth finally catching up to the people who'd been hiding from it. Dante offered to fund the reopening outright. I turned him down, and he didn't push, which told me more about how much he'd actually listened than anything else could have. He asked instead if he could invest quietly, as a silent partner, no name on anything, no strings I hadn't agreed to myself. That felt like the right shape for whatever we were building. Chosen, not owed. The renovation took longer than I planned, the way these things always do. I learned how to strip old varnish off a countertop with my own two hands, learned which supplier my father used to trust for the pie case, and which ones had raised their prices past what made sense, learned that Priya, of all people, was surprisingly good with a paintbrush and even better at telling me when I was making a decision out of grief instead of good sense. Dante showed up some evenings, not to oversee anything, just to sit on an overturned bucket and hand me tools while I worked, occasionally offering an opinion about paint color that I mostly ignored. It became its own kind of ritual, unhurried and unremarkable in the best possible way, nothing like the version of him I'd met that first night on the rooftop. There were harder days, too. A morning when the insurance paperwork from a decade earlier resurfaced during the final title transfer, and I sat in my car outside the county office for 20 minutes before I could make myself go in, my father's handwriting on those old forms hitting me harder than I expected it to. Dante didn't try to fix that day. He just showed up afterward with 2 coffees and sat with me on the diner's back steps until I was ready to talk about something else. I've come to understand that as its own kind of love, not the rescuing kind, just the staying kind. I reopened the diner on a Thursday in early spring. Same booths, reupholstered. Same counter, sanded and refinished by my own hands over 3 exhausting weekends. The smell of the fire was finally gone, replaced by coffee and grilled onions and something that felt for the first time in 2 years, like the future instead of the past. Dante came that night, not as anyone's savior, just as a guest, sitting at the counter like anyone else, letting me pour his coffee without either of us flinching at the memory of the first time I did that badly. We didn't get engaged that night. Nobody solved every danger in our lives with one grand gesture. What we got was smaller and, I think, more honest, a relationship we were choosing again deliberately one ordinary evening at a time. I stood behind that counter near closing, looking out a room full of people eating my father's recipes off my plates. And for the first time since he died, I didn't feel like I was carrying his unfinished business. I felt like I was living my own. She didn't need saving anymore. She'd already saved herself. What came next? She got to choose. And if you want to see where her story goes from here, stay subscribed because this is only the beginning of what she gets to choose. If this story pulled you in the way it pulled me in writing it, subscribe now and tell me in the comments which moment hit you hardest, because the next story I have for you might just top this one.